Uh, there we go. My name is Matt Reecer. I am the Connections Team Leader here at Hub City Fellowship, which is a fancy way of saying that I oversee our graphic design and social media needs. I'm typically at the back of the room hiding behind my laptop, so it's nice to see the front of your heads for a change. If you have your Bible or a Bible app with you, we are going to be in Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, and I'll read that out loud. So, Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13, it says, As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. And I do want to address that, yes, my name is Matthew, and I may have chosen this particular passage because I share the same name as the book. But that's beside the point. I wanted to start off today with a story about a dog. This particular dog, 5-year-old me named Coco. And Coco was a very furry, very handsome dog, which was good because he wasn't very intelligent. And Coco hated thunderstorms, like hated them. Specifically, he hated the thunder. And so anytime that there was a storm, he would retreat back to our laundry room, and he would stay there until the storm passed and couldn't be moved until then. But I remember there was one time in high school when he escaped and bolted out the front door. And that was to avoid the thunder. And quick science lesson, when there's a storm coming in, you can't go outside to avoid thunder. You're actually you're moving closer to its source. So and remember how I said Coco wasn't very bright. So I went after him, and by the time that I caught up to him, he was about a block away from our house. And so I had to go back and take him, or I had to go to where he was and get him back before it really began to rain. And in some ways, this is where the people of God are in the Bible. Over the past few weeks, if you're new or if you haven't been here in a while, we have been in a series called God's Instagram Story, where we've been looking at some of the major snapshots of the story of God and his people. So up to this point, God has called creation into existence, and then he entered into a covenant with a people called the Israelites. And then they turned to idolatry and very much tried to do things their own way. It didn't go well for them. So now we're at the climax of the story, and we're at the part where they're going to be brought back home, and they're going to be brought back into a right relationship with God. And most of us have heard the story. God sends his son, Jesus Christ, to restore that perfect relationship that Adam and Eve enjoyed with God before brokenness and suffering came into the picture. It was a relationship that wasn't tainted by sin. It was one where Adam and Eve were free simply to enjoy the presence of God and the presence of each other. And so today I want to expand on that idea, and I hope that you'll walk away with this, that in Jesus there's a place for you. The invitation is open to us just as it was to Matthew and the tax collectors and sinners that Jesus ate with in this passage, to come back home, to go back to that place where they were in right relationship with God the Father, back to that place where they're free to enjoy God, where they're free to enjoy the freedom from sin and brokenness, and where they have a purpose, and where we have a purpose. Will you pray with me? Loving God, we come to you today, and Father, my prayer is simply that you would move through this message. Father, I don't know who needs to hear that in you they have a place, that in you they have a purpose. Father, but I just ask that would be the takeaway from today, and that once again, God, that you would just move through this passage, that you would move through me, and that your presence would be felt in this place. Amen. So this particular passage begins with Jesus calling a tax collector by the name of Matthew And I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, if I can do that in a church, and say that Matthew had it rough. The Jews viewed tax collectors as traitors to their people. They were representatives of an oppressive Roman government, and most of them were greedy. In fact, at one point in history, it wasn't unheard of for smaller Jewish villages to just pack up and go start a new village if they heard that a tax collector was headed their way. So if you're ever feeling bad about yourself, I want you to try something. Take a deep breath and tell yourself this: at least I have never caused an entire village to pack up and go start a new settlement. So, Matthew is probably not well liked, and I imagine he was somewhat like the lepers that Jesus encountered. Those people were avoided because of their skin condition, but I would think that Matthew was probably somewhat of an outcast because of his job. He probably didn't have a people group that he belonged to, because if he was a Jew, his people would have rejected him. So he's hated. He's probably greedy if he's anything like his colleagues, but he's called by Jesus to follow him. Right before this passage, Jesus healed a paralyzed man and forgave him of his sin. So right off the bat in chapter 9, Jesus is showing us that he came for the broken and the lost. And in the Gospels, there's somewhat of a theme. When Jesus says to you, follow me, you do. There's not much discussion. You leave your nets if you're a fisherman, or you close up your tax collector's booth if you're a tax collector like Matthew, and you go. And it happens with Peter and Andrew, the first disciples that Jesus calls. Matthew does this too. He closes up his office and he leaves. And we don't know what happens between that point and what's about to happen, but Jesus ends up at Matthew's house. There's even a feast at this house, and some scholars agree that this was probably something that was thrown in Jesus' honor. But this feast contains an interesting mix of people, and it's not just a bunch of rabbis or the uppity religious people. It couldn't be, because it was Matthew's house and Matthew was there. Matthew's co-workers also come by, so they're tax collectors. And then there's this other group that the book of Matthew just calls sinners, which were most likely just people who didn't really see a need for religion in their lives. We have people like that today. So as all these people are eating, some murmurs begin to start around the table, and the Pharisees begin asking Jesus' disciples, hey, who's the, like, why is your teacher eating with all these people? And Jesus hears this and he replies, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And this rings true for us today. Aside from physicals and regular checkups, we don't really go to the doctor when things are well. Like, can you imagine what that would be like? You walk in and your doctor's like, hey, is there anything I can help you with? Like, what's going on? And you're like, oh, no, I'm fine. I had coffee today, breakfast, and then I ran 3 miles. And then your doctor's like, okay, so, like, why are you here again? We don't go to a doctor when everything is okay. But as I hope that this series has shown, things are not as they should have been. And that's why the world needed Jesus. That's why the world needed a Messiah. Jesus came to bring us back into the relationship that God originally intended, like what Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden before they fell into sin. Jesus has come to make things right. He's come to heal people and make them well, both literally and figuratively. Jesus goes on saying to the Pharisees, but go and learn what this means, which was actually somewhat of an insult. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And here Jesus is referencing Hosea 6:6, and in that passage, God is telling the Israelites, I'd rather see your faith lived out in acts of mercy rather than your sacrifices to me on an altar. What God desires is a changed life above anything else. In the Psalms, David writes, my sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, you, God, will not despise. In the book of Romans, Paul calls offering our bodies as living sacrifices true and proper worship. So even better than offering an animal on an altar is living out a life that was changed by God. And that's the best offering we can bring. That's what Jesus is living out, and that's what Jesus wants the Pharisees to see and learn here. Jesus finishes with this, for I have not come to call the righteous. He's still speaking to the Pharisees. And it's like he's saying, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that. For I've not come to call call the righteous, but sinners. And it's like he's saying, I didn't come for those who have it all together. I came for those who don't. He came for those who don't have it all together. And I love this passage because it so well illustrates Jesus' purpose here on earth. And everything that he said to the Pharisees, he's living out right in this passage, right in Matthew's house. I also like that this all takes place around a dinner table. Growing up and even now, the dinner table was a place of community. It was where my parents and I got together at the end of the day after they had returned home from work, after I had gotten home from school. It's where we meet with friends, even in biblical times. To share a meal with somebody was to call them a friend. And if there's a place at the table for those who think they have it all together, like the Pharisees or sinners or tax collectors, there's a place for you and I as well, because we fall into one of those categories. There are people who try to make it look like they have all their lives in complete order, or those who are well-to-do. There are outcasts. There are those who have nothing to do with Jesus and want nothing to do with him. But there's a place where we can come to know Jesus at a deeper level. There's also a place where we can sit and be changed by God's presence. The invitation is open to us today to join Jesus at the table and enter into a growing relationship with him. As I was preparing for this message, I thought back to a group that gathered not too long ago at my own house for weekly meals. And at that table were 3 people with seminary educations, 2 mature Christians, 2 atheists, and an alcoholic woman who tended to transition between an abusive living relationship and homelessness. So it really couldn't have been a stranger mix of people. And I see glimpses of that table in the story of this feast at Matthew's house. Because just like at my own table where I saw relationships form between the broken and the sinners and those who knew Jesus and the non-religious, I would think that the same thing happened at the table at which Jesus sat. And I know for the alcoholic woman I just mentioned, the people at this table were like a family to her because she really didn't have anyone like that here in Lubbock. That woman would actually go on to be baptized in a hospital bed. She was technically Hub City's first baptism. Sitting at the table with Jesus gives us a family to be a part of. I like the word that Jesus chose at the very end of what he said to the Pharisees. He came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And the word for call in the original language of the New Testament has connotations of being invited in or to call to oneself. So when Jesus is saying that he came to call sinners, he invites us in and he invites us in. I said the same thing twice. He invites them in and then he invites us in. He calls us into community with himself, but also with the other people who are gathered at that table. It's a spiritual family of sorts, and there's a place for you there. We have a place to truly encounter Jesus, a place of belonging, and in Jesus, we also have a purpose. In this passage, Jesus says, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick," and that he came to call sinners. Jesus wants to be that doctor. He's the one who calls sinners, so our purpose is to bring people to that table in hopes that they might encounter Jesus. As much as we'd like, we can't solve all the world's problems. Have any of you ever tried to do that? But the good news is that we don't have to. What we can do is pull up a chair to the table, and we can set out an extra plate or glass or silverware, and we can invite people to the table, the people Jesus said he came for. And these people may not even be aware of their need for him. But we can introduce the outcasts and the broken and the lonely and the sinful to the one who calls these people into a family, into community with himself, and who, by his power, can change their lives. We can say, "Hey, I'm sorry that the cancer came back," or we can say, "I'm sorry that you're mourning this loss in your family. And I can't be the one to take the cancer away. I can't be the one to give you peace during this time. But I can point you to the one who can." And that's our purpose. It's to point people to the guest of honor at the feast, Jesus. The other side of that is that there's always a place for more people at the table. There's room for others to come. There's room for other people to come, to belong, and to sit and eat, and to be changed by the presence of God. I was going to set that table up, but it's making me lose my spot. So we'll pretend that that table's all set up. What I like about the feast Matthew threw was that it wasn't just him and Jesus. It could have stopped there. Like Jesus and Matthew could have just gone back to Matthew's house and ordered a pizza and turned on a rerun of The Office or something, but that isn't how the story goes. Scripture says that many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And the thing is, that if there's a spot for me at the table, then there's a spot for those around me too. If I know I need Jesus, if I know his love for me, if I know his power, then who am I to think that the atheists, the alcoholics, the lonely, and the broken around me don't need him as well? As a Christian, I'm doing something wrong if I take my spot at the table, but don't make a way for others to join me there. There is a place for others to come and sit with Jesus. We just need to prepare it for them. So after sin and brokenness were introduced into the world, being able to just sit with God was entirely off the table. Before Jesus to have any communication with God, you had to offer sacrifices and go through a priest. But we see in this passage that Jesus offers something new and something different. Jesus gave up the highest throne for a dining room chair. Rather than waiting for all these people he's surrounded by to somehow make their way to his throne or to somehow make their way up to his heavenly temple, he comes to them and chooses to sit down with them where they are. And that's how God works. He came to a broken people who broke their relationship with a holy God, and he came to mend that relationship. So we don't have to jump through hoops today to try to get to God. He's a God who sits down with us and who invites us back into a right relationship with him. There's a place for you at the table. Let's pray.